So when we talk about making your guitar sound like it does on a certain album, we have to take into account many more things than we would with a normal guitar tone. Everyone starts with the amp, the cab, the speaker, and the microphone, but that's where most people stop. You also have to take into account the mic preamp, the room sound, the EQ, the compression, console saturation, the mastering EQ, the mastering compression, the tape machine if that album was on tape. And if that wasn't enough, there's probably more I didn't even mention. Lucky for us, somebody has already thought of that, and they're using the neural amp modeler to capture these legendary guitar tones and make them available to everyone in the form of NAMM profiles. I want to introduce you to Stu from Neutron Studios. He's a great guitarist and he's been producing albums since the 90s. He has the skills, the knowledge, and the gear to recreate and capture these famous tones. In this video, I have a conversation with Stu to talk about their latest release in the Producer Pack series, Van Halen 1984. He talks about the process of recreating that tone and how you can take it to your studio or to the stage. You have these new producer profile pack out, the Eddie Van Halen series. Tell me how these profiles are more than just your average profiles that's just like amp, speaker, mic. You were able to capture a lot more of the essence of what the tone is on the album.
I think that's because there's so much of the sound that you hear on a record that is not just the amp, and that's kind of a common theme with everything we're doing producer series wise, just trying to delve into what those things are. And for me, my background is as an engineer, as a guitar player, originally a session player when I was younger, and then an engineer and then a producer. So I spent all my time in and around studios, and to my ear hears the things that are not the amp, and I'm kind of frustrated always when I get a piece of gear or, hear a preset on something and it says it's something, and you're like, you're missing all this stuff that is important. But then you think, okay, but what self-respecting guitar product manufacturer is going to put tape simulation and compressors and studio gear in their guitar equipment? Because to most players, that's going to be like, what is this noise? You're like, get it out of my way. So what's really different about them is the profiles of the sound on the record. It's the best way I can describe it in short. And that includes everything that would be part of that recording chain up to the point where you hear it coming out of your stereo, from, streamed or album, CD, vinyl, radio, whatever it is, right? So, and that's something you've touched on in a little video you did, which I thought was very effective, just to kind of explain that there are these other things. But you do have, a recording chain that every single one of those things changes the sound in some way, to the point where, it might seem like a small thing on its own, but by the time you add up the large number of them, it can sound vastly different to the amp. The Metallica one's probably a good example when we did Justice for All, and I kind of picked that one for that reason. Van Halen, similar, although it is more like you can recognize what the amp is. It's definitely a Marshall Plexi, but there's some of these sounds where it's just so far away from the amp, you probably wouldn't even be able to guess what amp it was by the time it ends up on the record and mixed. And then, of course, you've got the effects on top as well, which, the studio effects can be part of the sound. They can be part of what your ear recognizes as the sound. So we're doing those as well. So we're including all the effects that are on the mixdown in the packs as a separate preset for Convolugy XT, which is a free convolution reverb plugin that has modulation as well. It's nothing to do with Neutron. We just use it because it's cool and it's free, and it's a great way for us to deliver like an all-in-one effect preset as well, where you get exactly the not just a reverb, a delay, the reverb, the delay, all the stuff, and it's all compounded into one single preset, all the same hardware, all the same settings kind of thing. So you get that real rich experience of hearing the exact recorded tone with the effects that are on the mix as well. And that whole experience then for the player is that, for me, that's the dream, like being the young child learning to play, listening to music and being like, oh man, I wish I had their rig, I could play through their rig, how would I sound through that stuff? To be able to do that is like a lifelong dream, and it's that thing that I've never had from any piece of equipment or software so far. That's always been like, oh, if only like somebody could do that and go in. And of course, it does require quite a lot of extraneous knowledge that isn't just about guitar. So for me, having lived that kind of life as the professional guitar player, and then as the studio recording engineer, mix engineer, and producer as well, I feel like I'm kind of maybe, well placed to understand and piece back together some of these missing elements that are the elusive factor when most presets, they could be 100% accurate in terms of exactly the right amp, maybe exactly the right microphone, all the right settings, but still there's this like gaping chasm between what you hear on the record and what's then coming out on the preset. And the poor guy, you know, maybe he's done his research and everything perfectly, and then someone's playing it and oh man, this doesn't sound like the record. And that's obvious when you understand how many of these other things there are. So we're trying to get all of them, and as many of them perfectly accurately as can be done. Obviously, with some of these old recordings, there's always a bit of guesswork if there's some unknown things. And Van Halen, bless him, did love a little fib when it came to answering questions about his setup and his gear. So wading through all of that and experimenting and comparing things, and was lucky enough to be able to get my hands on some isolated tracks that are now available. They're all on YouTube. So, you know, I guess we thank Rock Band for that or something. I don't know. But that's great because you can hear the guitar on its own. And that really gives me the ability to kind of zoom in with my producer's ear and start listening for what are these things that are going on this sound that aren't just the amp. Because kind of like the amp part, although with Van Halen, it's not necessarily like nailed down known. The thing is, for me, as an engineer, it's known. Like I can take the sound of a Plexi. I know it has a variac on it in his case. And I know that there is something happening to the sound of the guitar before it goes into the amp. And there's something happening after it comes out. I don't necessarily need to know exactly what those pieces of equipment are and what the settings are. If there are blanks, like I know that the sound has been changed. It's brighter going in. Maybe that's the bright cap on the input, or what, you know. So for the purists who are trying to uncover the mystery, they want to know exactly what was the mod on the amp. You know, what was the pedal, what was the EQ setting, and all this stuff. Whereas actually, for me to recreate the sound perfectly, I don't necessarily need to know those things. I just need to know what's happening to the sound and recreate that. Although, saying that, exhaustively, in all the cases where it's possible, we've actually done it with the real stuff.
As you said before in other conversations, you have a lot of respect for Eddie and the producers, so you don't want to give away all the secrets that you found through the process of making these profiles. But can you kind of talk about what you feel comfortable talking about, how these profiles are different and what you have been able to capture in these profiles? Like, what's the different process than just going through like an amp and speaker type of thing? What are the extra things that you've gone to do?
A little bit about the same process, but maybe not the way that most people are doing that to start with, which is that this all is profiled extremely loudly. Like the amp is really loud, and a huge part of the sound of Van Halen is actually the amp under extreme stress, extremely loud. The speaker, it's a combination of a couple of speakers. I hear mainly a greenback. There's talk about JBLs. I did profile the JBL as well in the process. And yes, profiling speakers is a thing. Although it's not a common thing yet, it will be soon. Hopefully we're doing that as well. But, so the speaker has this intense kind of impact on the sound. It's got an EQ curve, which is its kind of main, I guess its main characteristic, but then you've got compression and distortion and all these things that happen when you turn it up really loud. So in the case of Van Halen, what I hear missing from most things that try to cover that sonic territory is that they don't turn it up loud enough, and they're not capturing that sound, but then also they're using an impulse response for the speaker, which doesn't contain any of those dynamics, doesn't contain any distortion, doesn't contain any compression. It's not nonlinear. And that takes away that part of the sound, which is actually huge because it's old school Marshall, which means the preamp is doing almost nothing. It's hardly any gain coming from the preamp. It's loads from the power amp and even more from the speaker and just the general weight of the volume. The microphone also just bearing down under that weight of sound pressure because it's so loud, about 400 watts RMS probably from a Marshall stack when you turn it all the way up. And so, I mean, in terms of the individual details about how he's set the equipment up, there are a couple of things that I think are the secret that I think will be worked out at some point by somebody. But it's kind of, it's like superstition for me. You think he lived his life not telling anyone that for a reason, even though it's actually, I think, quite obvious when you get into the recreation. And so I just feel like it's a bad vibe for me to come along and now so soon after him passing as well, to be like, and here's the secret. It's like, it is the other thing that I think about this and why I love it. I don't believe if he told everybody what he did in 1978, how he was getting the sound, I don't think we'd be talking about it now. I think the mystery is actually part of the reason why it's still interesting to people and why it's something that they still talk about and think about and argue about, and I don't want that to go away either, So you're right, it's a huge respect for Eddie himself, but it's also like, I feel really that would make me sad that everybody went, okay, that wraps that one up. No more talking about, Van Halen anymore. So I don't really want to do it. And I don't think I need to do it because, as I've explained, I can have the safety net there of saying, there are some parts of it where I didn't need to know exactly what the EQ was being provided by that was changing the sound of the guitar. But the great thing is, in the world of Van Halen, he uses one sound the entire time. Oh, right. There are some slight changes to the amp for the different guitars. He's definitely, changing the amount of normal and bright channel for moving between his Gibson guitars and the Frankenstrat, because the fat Frankenstrat is way, way bright. It's like the pickup is damaged or something. It's like twangier than Telecaster, I think. So he was compensating a little bit for that just with the amp. But I think that the main point about him having the same sound all the time, combined with, and I was talking about this in our deep dive, the fact that we did beat it as well, which, although it wasn't on the album in 1984, was done in 1984 and had a really great little story attached, because there was an interview with Steve Lukather, who was on the session. And I know he was there because there's a photo of them together. So I'm like, okay, good. He was in the room. I trust Steve. He's got this great way of just letting information out without even realizing how important it is. And I've seen a couple of interviews where he talks about it, and then he says things like, oh yeah, and Eddie's amp was hired. And you just think, that's a random fact. Well, hang on a minute. Eddie's amp was hired. I've got a recording of him playing through a normal Marshall that's not modified, and now I've got something to compare to his amp. And that was like a light bulb. Okay, so now I know what's different about his amp to a normal Marshall. And, the input stage is different. Let's talk about mods. I don't believe there's any significant mods to the amp. I think it was biased differently. And I think that's actually what the people are hearing in some cases that they think is a mod. Because he's using the variac on his amp all the time, starving it of electricity, there's danger in that it can actually cause more load on the power stage, and it can make your valves blow up. And it could potentially stress your power supply as well and some other components in the amp. So what he did, I think, to compensate is he had his amp tech, which I think was Jose Arredondo, just to make it more confusing, because he's a famous Marshall modder, yeah? But I think he just had him really bias the amp really hot, because as you turn the voltage down, as you bias it up, you're feeding slightly more electricity to the components that aren't necessarily the ones making the sound, but they're the ones keeping the lights on in the amp, right? And so by compensating for that starvation of electricity going in and feeding the actual, components of the amp with a bit more juice, it stopped it from becoming just constantly breaking, constantly blowing valves and that kind of thing. So there was part necessity there, but I think also part that was the sound that he liked. And when you listen to Beat It, you can clearly hear it sounds a bit like a bee in a jar, because he's still using the variac on this hired amp, but not without the extra. These are details. I know it sounds like maybe this is not the kind of thing juicy things that people might want to know, but these are the real reasons why it sounds different. So it was really obvious to me that this biasing thing was a huge part of it. So that was definitely an avenue that we explored until we got it sounding really, really close. And the behavior started to match. And we're talking about that again in the video, the word behavior I use a lot, particularly on Panama. When he plays Panama and he turns the volume down, again, this is the great thing about Van Halen when you're trying to get this stuff worked out. He's using the same sound for an entire song, and he's just using the volume control on his guitar. So like that change, I'm not talking just, it becomes clean when he turns the volume down, revelation. Most people will be like, oh, yeah, obviously. But it does it in a really weird way on Panama. You listen to it. He turns the volume down on his guitar when he's playing the middle section of the solo where it gets quiet and vibey. And when he does that, it gets darker sounding, not brighter, which is really weird. If you ever play a Marshall Plexi, particularly with the bright channel up high at all, or even slightly in the signal chain, the minute you turn the volume on the guitar down, it's a twang fest. Mm-hmm. It's super bright. That high frequency energy going into the overdrive stage of the amp is like massive compared to the normal frequencies of the guitar. So I thought that was weird. And again, so these little avenues beyond, that's the right amp, that's the right speaker, oh, that's the right sound. This kind of behavioral element to the sound that I was really interested in, because it's how he's using it as almost as an instrument itself. And that has to be captured for me. I can't just have it like you play a chord and you go, oh yeah, it sounds like, everything has to work the same way. And so when you listen again on the deep dives, or if you play these profiles yourself, you'll notice that they do behave differently to each other and to a normal Marshall and the way that it behaves. And it's all this compounded all these little changes adding up to strange behavior when you feed it different types of signal. And that, in many ways, that is what the sound is. A valve being distorted is like, there are only so many ways to cook that egg. And every amplifier and preamp that has a valve in it that's ever made is based around that same thing, which is basically the same core sound. A valve, assuming it's like an ECC 83 or a 12AX7 for your Americans, then that is going to sound more or less the same in terms of what the valve part is doing when it creates its distortion and the types of harmonics and all that kind of thing. So that's like, there's not many ways that you can really deal with that part of it. There's EQ that goes into it, and there's EQ that comes out of it, and that's pretty much every preamplifier ever made explained, right? And then you've got the power amp, which can be one of several things depending on the country of origin and the manufacturer. You've got your 606s, you've got your EL34s, and you've got the biasing of that power amp, which can affect the prominent frequencies. When you bias it hot, it pushes mid frequencies and lower mid frequencies forward, balances them against sort of highs, and you get a bit more ruggedness in the low end. Becomes a bit less spongy, a little bit less sag when you turn the bias up as well. It's kind of biasing a valve amp, although this is not a technical correctness. It's kind of to the ear, it makes it go more towards the territory of a solid state amp. It takes away all of the kind of the juicy sponginess of valves. The more you bias it, the more voltage they have spare, and therefore the more they're able to take the signal and deliver it closer to what you're putting in without sagging and distorting and all this other thing. So typically, biased correctly, all of that behavior is going to be present in most valve amps. You're going to see quite a lot of the power stage doing its thing, particularly in the old Marshalls, even up to like the JCM 800. People quite often will buy those amps. I mean, I've done it before, don't get me wrong, when I was a younger man. Bought myself a nice JCM 800, brought it home, turned it on, and been like, what the hell is this? This is a clean amp. And then realizing, oh, it only sounds good past 6. No, wait, like that's lethal. I'm going to get myself some of those earmuffs they wear on runways at airports, and then you can't hear it anyway because it's so freaking loud. It's too dangerous to be anywhere near to listen to. But anyway, yeah. So that's the kind of secret that isn't a secret. And the way that he combined the equipment. Let's just say that he had lots of pieces of Lego available to him, a few different amplifiers, a few different speakers, a few different toys that he used to get the signal in and out of them in different ways in the studio. And there was just a combination of them that he used, which is the one that matches the sound on the record. And that's pretty much all I need to say, and allow people to carry on going down that wonderful rabbit hole to try and find that combination for themselves. But if they want to experience the sound and play through it, I mean, the great thing about the producer series stuff, which is why I feel safe talking about this in the way that if I say to people, go and try the sound, and it's really close, it's really authentic to the record and that behavior and all that stuff, is because I don't feel cheesy saying that when the record is there as a reference. You can always check it if you want to. It's not like me just saying, hey, it's great. We think it's great, and we made them, so obviously we think they're great. But I was doing that exact same thing in the process of making them and using that reference of the original recording. The neural amp modeler part is hugely important. We're using neural amp modeler for all of this stuff because it's so good, disproportionately good compared to everything else that we've tried at combining multiple non-linear processes into one profile. So like you could take any of the existing modeling products and just put on the effects loop of an amplifier and capture just the preamp, say, or use a reactive load and and plug the amp into that and profile it, and it's going to come out pretty much the same on all of them, because that's one, or maybe if it's really loud, then two non-linear distortion processes occurring, the preamp and the power amp. Most of them can have a go at two, most of them. Once you start getting into three, add the speaker into the mix as well, and a microphone, 4, and a compressor on the desk, 5, and a tape machine, 6, and and on and on and on and on. The information goes in one way and comes out as some kind of guess that sounds nice. That's the other thing, is like, the Kemper and the Cortex is the same. What they create is nice sounding, and it sounds very, very similar. But all of that behavior of the multiple kind of parallel, non-linear, separate systems all behaving in different ways, that behavior is lost. That information is lost.
Talking about Neural Amp Modeler, all these tones are available as profiles for the Neural Amp Modeler. Can you talk about these different profiles? You have some that are meant for recording, and then some that are meant for live use.
Right. There's 3 types of profile. One of them is called an all-in-one, and that should be fairly self-explanatory. That's everything in one: the speaker, the amp, the pedals, everything in a single profile that you load up, and you get the amp tone that's on the record. Each of those will also have a accompanying effects preset for convology, if there are effects on the sound. Some of them they just have the sound of the room on, and that's in the profile. We have to put the room in there for reasons that are important to the way that the studio effects work. If you compress the sound of a room, that's very different to having a compressed sound with a room on it. So we have to feed the acoustics in. You've got the DI, which is just the amp part. So that's more like a traditional amp profile, but it has no speaker. So I use the term DI because it's one that I'd seen in that world being used a lot to mean the profile of the amp with the speaker turned off. So if you wanted to use one of these sounds live, the DI is definitely your go-to, because it's the kind of the core tone. It's the amp, what was coming out of the speaker of the amplifier before you put the microphone in front of it and did all the studio magic. But then the third profile type is what we've called the production profile, and that is everything else. So you get the two halves. If you're curious, you can hear what the production was doing to the original amp sound, and you can hear the original amp sound as well. So the third one also is useful in a recording context, because maybe you have a similar kind of amp and you just want to see what happens when you run it through that recording chain. It's going to give it a nice, like, immediately produced sound. I mean, obviously you want to be using something that's similar in order to get similar results, but that doesn't mean you can't try out and see what, putting a Mesa Boogie through a profile that was made for a Marshall and just see what it sounds like. It's just kind of production elements that are added: the speaker, the tape machine, the mixing console, the outboard, EQ, and all that kind of stuff that was used on the mixing process for that record are now available as well as a kind of third wheel in the story. So it's all in one, and then I split that in half, basically: the DI, just the amp, and then everything else in the production. Mainly because of the curiosity of it, I think. Not that I haven't really necessarily come up with the best thing to use the production profiles for, other than running your own amp silently through a reactive load to make it sound kind of more like a recorded amp rather than just an amp in a room.
Have you gotten any feedback from users yet?
Yeah, we have. I mean, it's interesting, because one of the things that loads of people have been saying is, hey, we'd love to use these live. And they've been asking us about that from the perspective of Neural Amp Modeler. And we talked a little bit about using Reaper to host it for live use, but recently I've been looking at Gig Performer. And I'm starting to look at that as a way to actually develop something that we could kind of create an all-in-one live performance system that incorporates Neural Amp Modeler. There are some plugins out there that have started to use it as their sound profile type, or have it as a compatible one, but not any of them that I've seen are really geared towards live playing. And I mean that in, like, having the ability to configure spillover on your effects and seamless patch changing and set list management. And I'm talking about proper professional live performance, incorporating the profiles that we make into a system that could then be used. So Gig Performer is pretty cool. I've only started using it in the last kind of 4 or 5 weeks, and we've started trying to put together something that's really good. So a lot of the feedback is about that. How we love these sounds. We don't want them to just be played, with a DAW. How can we use them live? Is the biggest question we've had so far. And also, what's next is the other thing. And we would really encourage people, actually, if they go and watch any of the deep dives or any of our content, if they've got any kind of idea about what they'd like to see as one of these packs, then go and leave a comment, because we do really consider that. It's kind of the whole point of it. It's what people want. So we've started with these kind of big artists, the ones that are, the billion stream a year kind of artists, because we really want to make sure that people get a chance to have that sound that they wanted when they were young, when they started playing, when they were inspired by the player and the sound. That's really the dream for me, is to get people able to realize that and experience it, and get them maybe playing more and spending less time chasing that sound, because so much of what makes the sound on the record is unattainable for people who don't have experience as an engineer or producer. So it's kind of it's a thankless task. You chase your tail forever unless you want to go and learn those skills. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing anyway. Please go and learn about recording and mixing and producing. But if you just want to hear and play that sound, then maybe it's time to concede that it's not something that the guitar player was ever meant to do themselves, to take it that far to get exactly the sound on the record. That was always a job for actually a trained professional in another field. So if you relinquish that responsibility as a guitar player and you're prepared to just go, oh, I just want to play it, then that's what these are for. It's to kind of give people that option that I've never seen. It's not something that I've ever seen being done. So hopefully we get some more happy customers, and also a bit of a discussion maybe about what we should do. They take quite a while, so it's kind of, there does need to be an order. We're not going to be chucking these out one a week. It's particularly for things that there are unknowns, where there has to be a lot of investigation and experimentation to finally nail down, okay, there we go, we've got it now, that can take weeks.
Quality over quantity here.
Pointless to do another preset. There's been so many being done in, countless devices over a long period of time. I think for me, it's a loop that people are caught in. They buy the new device, they load up the preset of their favorite artist, they go, and then they learn how to program it, and maybe they get closer even than the manufacturer did. So my theory with Neutron is for this product at least, we want to decouple the sound from the equipment and interact with players and say, look, let's just talk about the sound. You can just have access to the sound. The equipment that you play it on is, hopefully you have a PC or a Mac. The plugin is free. The plugin you're loading the effects preset on is also free. So there's no price of entry here for you to start thinking more about the sound. Not, oh, if I want that sound, I need to buy X, Y, Z. It's like the sound is now a thing on its own. And that's thanks to this new profiling technology that's become available in only the last 2 years, I would say. It's become advanced enough that you can say, okay, now it sounds exactly the same as what I'm putting in, what I'm getting back. And that doesn't always mean it's good. That depends on what you're feeding it, I suppose, right? But for me as a producer, that was an exciting point, because at that I'm like, well, now I can start feeding it all this stuff. Why would I go into a studio and recreate the sound of Van Halen only to sit there and play it for a couple of hours and go, yeah, I've done it, that's great. Maybe make a YouTube video. And then okay, that's a wrap, guys. Now you can put that in a bottle and you can turn it into something that everybody can actually experience. And that's producer series. Just that principle. We want to take all the things that we know about recording, add those to all the things that loads of people already know about guitar sounds, create something that is then that final kind of dream for most players. They go and buy a piece of equipment and they want to buy that amp because that's the amp the person they like plays. But when they think, oh, I like that, the sound of that player, they're thinking of the record that they heard that player was on, and actually, then you're back into the same loop. So that's really what we're hoping, is that the customers now start getting vocal about what they want, so that we can start building some sort of a plan about, what order we attack the vast history of recorded guitar in, beyond the obvious stuff. Van Halen for me was like, I don't care what you want. That's what I want. We're doing that. And there's a couple of those. There's a couple of those. Metallica was another one for me, because that was the album. The Justice for All album was the one that started me playing. That was the one that I listened to, and people laugh because it's to most people it's not their favorite sound, but to me it's that's the reason I started playing guitar. So of course it's important to me, and I want to hear it. And it's such a dream. It's like the big beaming smile that you get when you're like, there it is. That's exactly it. And you play the riff or whatever, and you get it half decently played and think, yeah, there we go.